Welcome back to the Christadelphian video service and our series on aids to Bible study under the theme of rightly dividing the word of truth. We're hoping this is going to be of use to Christadelphians of all ages, and especially to those younger ones amongst us who would like to learn how to Bible study more effectively. And we'd like you, as you go through these series, to stop and to close just to stop the recording so that you can actually go off and have a check of the matter, do the exercises where there are exercises to do, but work through it at your own pace. We have to record it at one pace, but you're welcome to stop it and start it so that you can effectively do all the exercises that might be there. So we are looking at the King James Version margin, the Oxford Bible particularly, to make sure this is accessible and useful to all of those who use that particular translation or version of the Bible. So remember the benefits of our margin. Just running through very briefly what we saw last time, that the margin is something that's readily available to all of us who have a King James Oxford Bible. It gives you cross-references, alternate translations, suggestions, original meanings. It's not a commentary, but it gives additional information. Sometimes even historical details are added in the margin. So we have links to references. So I want to now, in this session today, to actually look how we trace a theme through the Bible. So if we come to Exodus chapter 17, verse 2, we have an occasion where the Jews, having left Egypt, began to complain against God for the lack of water that they felt was happening. And they were murmuring, they were complaining and threatening Moses. And so we come to Exodus chapter 17, verse 2. So the people began to chide with Moses, and they said, "Give us water that we may drink." And Moses said to them, "Why chide you with me? Wherefore do you tempt the Lord?" So when you see that little phrase, the little L there, tempt the Lord, that's something we can follow through. The theme of tempting God. How we in different ways can tempt God. And when we talk about tempting God, it's not causing God to sin. It's actually causing God to get angry. We are upsetting God by the way that we are talking and behaving. So you see there's a great long list of references. So it's in Deuteronomy 6 where Moses refers to it just before his death. It's recorded in the Psalm 78 and Psalm 95. There's a similar occasion in Isaiah chapter 7 where someone doesn't want to tempt God. Then you get it in Malachi chapter 4. You get it in Corinthians. You get it in Hebrews. So there's a way you can follow the theme of tempting God right through the Bible and see different people who actually did that as you go through that theme. So it's a theme in the margin. So when you get all those references, it's telling you there's a theme you can follow through. And that's a very, very useful thing to start your study on a theme. So always look for those. Let's go to Exodus 16, verse 34 while we're here. And it says there that it was kept before the manna was put into the ark. It was kept before the testimony to be kept. And before the testimony has a great long chain of references, the theme of the testimony or the ark that you can follow through. So again, it's a thematic study for you by the hand of the translators. And you'd be amazed how many times they've got all of the references they should have in these particular summaries. So again, this is a thematic link to references. Exodus 18, verse 1. And you can see this is not uncommon because we're just staying in the one section. In Exodus 18, verse 1, it says, "When Jethro," and you go to the margin with the little E, and it says in the margin, chapter 2, verse 18. So it then takes you back. So you're now being led back to the first reference to Jethro. So let's go back to Exodus 2, verse 18. Instead of giving you all the quotations about Jethro in chapter 18, which is in the history, you now get the first one. And Jethro is an interesting character because he's actually called by a couple of different names. But we go to Exodus chapter 2 and verse 18. We read about this one. They came to Reuel, their father. So there's another name for Jethro. So when you look up the margin, you've got it all explained to you. because it says there in the little r, Numbers 10:29, called also Jethro or Jether, chapter 3 verse 1, 4 verse 18, 18 verse 1. So you can actually trace through the whole story of the life of Jethro in the Bible through that list of quotations. So this is a thematic suggestion to you to follow through a subject thematically when you get it like that in the margins. And when you get a list of quotes, it actually says there's a theme here, there's a character you can follow, and it'll always, if there's a lot of references, it'll take you back to the first one, and then you move on from there. So we note the two names Jethro is given. For Bible characters that are frequently mentioned and regular themes, there is not a complete list given. You'll get a list which goes part way down, then you get an etc. In other words, look it up for yourself. And you'll need to then follow through from the last quote you were given, the chain as it goes through the Bible. Otherwise, it would have been far too many quotations on some characters. For example, we talk about Abraham. There's a couple of hundred references to Abraham in the Bible. You couldn't list them all in the margin. So you'll get the first one, and then you'll get the next one, and then there you go. There you'll get the next one. You'll get a chain of references through the Bible that way. So you don't always get a complete list. Remember this, the first reference usually contains all the other references. Subsequent references take the reader back to the first reference. It might be back to Genesis chapter 1. So, it goes back to the first time this theme or this idea has come up, and it'll take you right back to the beginning. So just something to remember, you can always follow through, but you won't always get the complete list. But it's a great resource. There's actually a list of common themes, common references that you can follow through, and the translators have done all the hard work for you. Let's look now at alternative renderings. So sometimes in the margin you get a number of letters you put into the margin. So you'll get or, and you'll then have another word being substituted. So the word in the margin, which will be in italics, is the substituted word from the word that they are trying to translate. So you get, or it might be 10 letters, whatever they put in the margin, is another rendition to try and improve the flow of thought. Let's go to Genesis chapter 4. And you will see from a couple of these references how critical it is to look at the margin and to see that the translators are struggling to know what to put in a certain place. So Genesis 4 verse 13 is the story where Cain is being sent away by God for killing his brother. And Cain said to the Lord in verse 13, "My punishment is greater than I can bear." Then you go to the margin. "Mine iniquity is greater," and notice how it changes from italics to uppercase or to normal case, "than that it may be forgiven." Now, that's quite a different meaning to what you read in verse 13 in the text. Is his punishment greater than he can bear, or is he really saying God can't forgive me? And I believe that the margin is actually more accurate. Cain got on with his life. He went and had a glorious life of, great family, became great industrious people, built cities. I don't think Cain spent the rest of his life in misery. I think the margin's probably got it right. But you'll notice in the margin that some of it's in italics and some isn't. The bit that's not in italics has no supporting Hebrew. So if you just read that from the Hebrew without the letters that are in upright shape, it would be, "Mine iniquity is greater than be forgiven." Now, in the Hebrew, that probably made perfect sense. The translators, to put it into English, have had to put extra words in. But in the margin, you're getting an alternate rendering to try and help you understand what was really said. And you can see how much it changes the meaning of what was being said. Come down to verse 26. This one, again, is a critically important one. So here is the replacement for Abel. To Seth, to him was born a son. He called his name Enos. And then this is the phrase that the translators were struggling with. "Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord." So was it that men now began to pray? Well, no, I think people have been praying for a long time. We're now 130 years into history by the time that Seth is born. And he's had a son, so we're looking down about the barrel about 200 years. So I'm sure people were calling upon the name of God before that. The margin is much more accurate. And leaving out the letters that are upright, just let's read the original Hebrew they've given us. To call by the name of the Lord. And they put in themselves, because that's the implied meaning. Men began to call themselves by God's name. So now you had two distinct classes in the earth being developed. There were those who were the sons of men, the children of Cain, and those who were the sons of God, the children of Seth and Adam. There were two separate classes now being developed. So, that is indicating that those who were following Adam and Seth were people who were seeking after God, who wanted to be known by the name of their God, and so called themselves by that name, whereas those that had left away from God were not interested in God at all. So you can see, can't you, that when you get that alternate rendition in the margin, that it's actually very, very helpful, because they are saying, look, the original Hebrew says something a little bit different. Sometimes it will say, instead of or, it will say Greek Hebrew. In other words, the original Greek Hebrew is a little bit different than what we've given you. And because it didn't seem to fit, they put in what they thought was the best way in English to express themselves. But they're actually telling you that if you go to the literal Greek or Hebrew, it means something else. Quite interesting that that's important. Let's go to the book of Daniel. And I love Daniel chapter 8 because I feel so sorry for the translator that had to do this, because the visions of Daniel are not easy. Daniel struggled to understand, to apply them, to work them out. And you can imagine a translator in 1611 coming along with very little knowledge of history, looking at some of these incredibly complex visions that Daniel was given of rams and goats bashing into each other, and trying to make some sense of it. So when we come to Daniel chapter 8 and verse 3, Daniel says, I lifted up mine eyes and saw, behold, there was a ram which had two horns. The two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. And you go to look at the margin, where it says the little number 8. It's an 8, then the second. All right. So it should be the other or the second. Obviously, the Hebrew indicates it was the second one in the vision, but they put in the other one, which is, again, not wrong, but could have been done better. And then you go on to some of the other things that are there. Go down to verse 5. And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west, and his face upon the face of the whole earth, and he touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And you think, what's that all about? Well, in verse 2, the little 2 in the margin for he touched not the ground, it says, none touched in the earth. And you can read that two ways. You could say that he moved so swiftly, he appeared to be flying, so his feet touched not the ground, or you can say that nobody could stand up to him. Nobody could touch him. And actually, both of those applications are true of Alexander the Great. He had very fast campaigns, noted for his use of cavalry, but nobody could withstand him. Now, the other thing we read about this particular goat, it had a notable horn between its eyes. In the Hebrew, they say Hebrew, a horn of sight. And so you can see that there is this horn that was there. It was a horn of sight. It was something that dominated where he was going, so he would be very focused on where he was charging, and the horn was connected to that. But again, you can see how the alternative rendition in the margin has been given, because they were obviously unsure what to put. Well, now we come down to verse 13. And it's talking about a little horn that came out of out of the goat. And it says, and a host was given him. You go to your margin, little number 9. A host was given over for the transgression against the daily, and they put the word sacrifice on the end. In the text in verse 12, the word sacrifice is in italics, so they're admitting that they don't have any basis for it. But obviously it was to do with the daily sacrifice of Israel, that they offered morning and night a lamb. But you can see the translators are really struggling. And, that in verse 12, a little comment is made, a host was given him. So it's fascinating when you go to John chapter 19 and verse 11, when Jesus was discussing this with Pilate. Pilate said to Jesus, I have power to do what I like with you, to release you or to kill you. And Jesus said, you would have no power except it was given you. And that's, of course, a direct quotation, allusion from Daniel 8, verse 12. It's been given you. And this, of course, this little horn is talking about the power of Rome in the east. And they've been given power to crucify the Son of God and to rule over Israel at that time. And Jesus just reminds him that any power he thought he had came from the hand of God. So again, the alternative rendition in the margins are very, very helpful and useful and should always be looked at and examined. So if you have to prepare a talk or present a study or write an article, just be careful using alternative renditions from the margin. They're usually helpful, but always check them out. Sometimes the comments are not always perfectly correct. 95% of the time, very good. Probably about 5% need a little bit more checking. So always check it out for yourself, but it's a good lead of where to start. So when you come to looking at the italics in the margin, you'll notice in your margin that sometimes the alternative rendering that they give you is not in italics. Where that occurs, it means there is no actual Hebrew or Greek word in the original text to support the suggested word they put in. Now, most occasions they put it in to make sense in an English sentence, but there is no original word in there. So in the actual text of the verse, it will be probably in italics, if it's there. If it's offered in the margin as an alternate rendering, and it's not in italics, then you know that it's been included for the sense only. Look at the example in Daniel chapter 9 in verse 26. And again, I feel very sorry for the translator of the book of Daniel. It says this in verse 26, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. Go to the margin, or shall have nothing. Now that's the literal Hebrew. They couldn't work out what that meant. So they put in, but not for himself. Well, we know from the Bible that one of the things that was said of the Messiah when he was to be crucified, he would be set at naught. He would be regarded as nothing by the crowd. They would despise him, they would boo him, they would cheer him, they would spit on him. You're talking about the way Jesus would be degraded. He shall have nothing. None of his self-preservation would be left. None of his instincts of shame, none of his pride would be left. He would be completely insulted and humiliated. So we can understand that. The translators were struggling and they put in an alternative. They put the original Hebrew in the margin, but put in, but not for himself, which is not a very good translation at all. So when you get this not in italics, it's an inserted word to add it in. And you can see in verse 27, it goes on to say, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And again, the margin's giving us an opportunity, the little 8 there, or A, you shall confirm a covenant. So they've said, look, we put in the, it should be A in the original. All the way through the book of Daniel, they're struggling with some of these concepts. And you can see that in the little 6 in verse 26, the people of the prince shall come and destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the original is, and the prince, and they put messiahs in, future people. Well, again, it's very poorly translated. I'm not going to expound Daniel at this particular stage, but you can see how much they were struggling with their translation, and they've given you a number of alternate renditions. So we're really talking about using our margin. Look at the comments, check them out. Be aware that some parts of those alternate translations are put in for giving sense, and always check out the comment for yourself. Some very useful margin alternatives. Let's just look at a couple of really good ones. So go to the book of Genesis 21 and verse 33. Genesis 21, and we'll pick it up in verse 33. These are just simple, good ones from the margin. And Abraham planted a grove Now, you go through the Bible, and a grove is normally an idolatrous place that was often used for sexual worship in the terrible worship of the Canaanites. Whenever you read about groves, it was normally in a very bad context. Well, it should be a tree, and it's got that in the margin, or tree. Why they put grove in, goodness knows. But it was a tree, and he planted a tree there, and he called on the name of God. So again, you can see that that's a much better rendition. And you'll find that, and we won't go through all these examples. I invite you to stop the recording and to go and look at all these other occasions where you'll see in the margin a much better rendition of a word which is given to you. And you can see then the value of using your margin. So the alternative there is often correct. And you do have to wonder sometimes why they put some of the words they did put into the text when they actually knew that there was a better word available, which ended up in the margin. But we're grateful that we have that little clue to go and start looking. Now, sometimes you get names in margin. Let's go to Isaiah 7 and 8, because in this particular context with Isaiah and King Ahaz, the names of the children that are referred to are incredibly significant in the message that was being given by the prophet. We're reading Isaiah chapter 7. And here was a prophecy to try and encourage the King Ahaz to have some faith. And it was done by Isaiah using his two sons. And so in verse 3 of chapter 7, go forth now to meet Ahaz, thou and Shear-Jashub thy son. And the name Shear-Jashub, the particular son of Isaiah that was there, actually has a meaning. If you look at the margin for little 2, it says, the remnant shall return. So here was an offer of mercy. Yes, there is going to be a judgment upon you, but God will bring back a remnant. Not everybody's going to be destroyed. So that was the first message, the offer of mercy. Then you come to chapter 8, verse 3, where the second son is now marched up to the king. And we read about this son, that his name is called Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. And you think, wow, there's a lot of words in that. And of course, this name, it again has a meaning which is quite significant. And this name means to speed the spoil and haste to the prey. And so these names were in themselves prophecy. One was a prophecy there can be mercy if you work with God. The second one was because you have refused the signs, then judgment is going to come. And it was actually being achieved in the names of those boys. And so you need to always check with your margin when you have these names brought up. Okay, well, let's go on to Isaiah 62 and verse 4. And again, you'll see the significance of names being used as part of a prophecy. And this is a prophecy which Isaiah gave. And it talks about two particular women. We're talking Isaiah 62 verse 4. It says, thou shalt no more be called forsaken, neither shall thy land any more be termed desolate, but you shall be called Hephzibah, and thy land Beulah. You go to your margin for Hephzibah, it's got my delight is in her, and Beulah means married. And it explains that. So, the prophecy came out with putting names applying to the nation of Israel and their land, and that they would again be married to God. So again, you can actually see that the names are significant, and it's actually in the margin for you just to show you exactly that's what it means. Sometimes you get other names of people. So you come to Matthew chapter 1, and where, of course, you've now got in the Greek language, some names appear differently in the Greek. For example, Elijah comes up as Elias, and some of the names going across the records are changed because of the different language. Now, in Matthew chapter 1, we have a genealogy. Get to Matthew chapter 1, and we're picking up in verse 11. And it says, and Josias begat Jeconias and his brethren about the time they were carried away to Babylon. You go to the little 4 in the margin, it says sometimes, or some read, Josias begat Jakim, and Jakim begat Jeconias. And that gives you a reference of the kings to that particular family of that line of the kings on the throne of David. So again, the other names that they are known by, the different renderings are given to you in the margin. So again, the margin is very helpful, and particularly when it gives you cross quotations to look at. So here's a few questions to ponder. I'm not going to answer these in particular, but just something to think about. When you go through the book of Hebrews, and particularly chapter 1, it's just loaded with Old Testament quotations. And we have to say, why is Paul heaping on the loaded quotations from the Old Testament in writing the book of Hebrews? When you go to Hebrews, Paul does remarkable things. He just says things like, and he makes a quotation by saying in David, or as it is in the second Psalm, or as it is written, and he just rattles off scripture after scripture after scripture through the book of Hebrews, not always giving you the source. And the translators have done their best to try and find the sources of those quotations. And you can only follow through all those themes and aspects about the scriptures used by knowing the source of the quotations. Paul never quotes from a context without good reason. Often he's quoting a whole context and just gives you one key verse as the link. So your margin will help you to go back and to find many of those quotations in their original context. So, Paul was obviously doing this because the Hebrews always gave reverence to the Holy Scriptures of the Old Testament. And so to prove things about Christ, he needed to prove it from the Old Testament. So very useful, your margin, helping you find the source of those just off-the-cuff quotations he throws into his writing. So our conclusion about margins is that they are a very useful tool. The detailed margin in the Oxford edition of the King James Version is particularly useful. And that's why I encourage you to have a King James in your toolkit of Bible study aids so that you can go there and get the information from that very good margin in that Bible. If you don't have one, get one. Very good investment. You can pick them up in second-hand shops, in bookshops at a very reasonable price. Most ecclesias have book sales occasionally or fundraising sales, and I'd be surprised if there weren't some good editions that are no longer needed that you can get your hands on. Very, very useful edition to have, and it's a good source Bible for many Bible studies. Your homework, well, I want you to look up the margins of Daniel 8 and 9 and see what you can learn just from reading the margins. Check out the alternate translations of Daniel chapter 9, verse 22 to 27, and other good translations that you might have, like Rotherham, like the Interlinear Bible, if you have one, the ESV and the Net Bible. Check it out in good translations to see how much the translators were struggling. But I want to leave you with Daniel 8, verse 13. Let's just go there, because I personally have been studying angels all my life, and this particular verse in Daniel 8 just shows you how the translators were really, really under the pump, struggling with the translation in Daniel chapter 8. Verse 13 reads in the AV, King James Version, "Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision?" Now, I want to just concentrate on the first part of that. You can see that they're struggling. When you get in the margin, the 2 and the 3 put together, you can see how they're absolutely struggling. And the margin says, and this is the literal Hebrew says, or the number of secrets, or the wonderful numberer. And then number 3, Hebrew is Palmoni. Now, that's not the name of an angel. That is the title of an angel. This angel is Gabriel, and this is one of the titles of Gabriel, where he works with Michael on the divine calendar. And at the end of chapter 10, verse 21, we are told that only Gabriel and Michael have the intimate knowledge of the timeline that God is working through for history, and they have to make nations line up to that timeline. So in this context, Gabriel is the wonderful numberer. The word Palmoni is a 2-part word. You might recognize Pele, which means wonderful. It's the name that the angel gave to Samson's mother. My name is wonderful, Pele. It's also, it means wonderful. But when you come to Moni or Menai, it's what's used in the writing on the wall. Mene, tekel, numbered. So this is a combination of those 2 root words. It means the wonderful numberer. And this is a title of Gabriel in the role of giving the time periods. And of course, we're going to get time periods in this chapter, because Daniel 8 and chapter 9 talk about 2,300 days and then 490 days, 70 weeks prophecy. So we are dealing with the revelation of time periods here. So we have this particular situation, and the word saint is a dreadful translation. It should be holy one. So we are here seeing Daniel overhearing a conversation between two angels. I heard one holy one, or one angel, speaking, and another said unto him that spoke. And so Gabriel is giving Daniel the message. He's speaking, and Daniel's hearing Gabriel speaking what the words of the early part of the chapter. And another angel says to the one who was speaking, the Palmoni, how long? So there's an inquiry from another angel to the Palmoni, to Gabriel, the wonderful number. There's an inquiry made by another angel, and Daniel hears that inquiry about how long. And of course, Daniel is very interested in that answer as well. Just a little point for you to note that the Palmoni doesn't answer the other angel. What he does is he gives the answer to Daniel. He said unto me. And that's just a case of careful Bible reading we'll talk about later on. So the Palmoni is intent on revealing the information to Daniel. The other angel was saying, I've got a question. And he asked the question. And you can just see how the poor translators were completely and utterly lost in the margin of Daniel chapter 8 and verse 13. And it's fascinating when you actually work out what's actually going on. But there's a bit of a teaser for some of the things you can find when you look at your margins and you do a bit more work on it yourself, and you can actually develop the thoughts that are there. But again, what they put in the margin is what the Hebrew was telling them. What they put in the text is what they thought, an interpretation of what they thought it might mean. And in that case, they got it pretty wrong. So that's your homework. So thank you again for listening, and we look forward in our next session to move on to another aspect of Bible study. Thank you.